June 22, 1941. As dawn broke across the vast frontier stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, the stillness of the summer morning was shattered. At precisely 3:15 a.m., German artillery unleashed a thunderous barrage, lighting the horizon in fire. Thousands of shells arced across no man's land, slamming into Soviet positions. Within minutes, the Luftwaffe roared overhead, unleashing wave after wave of bombers upon airfields, railways, and cities. Contrails scarred the pale sky, while below, villages were torn apart in blinding flashes. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history, had begun. More than 3 million German soldiers surged forward, supported by 3,600 tanks and nearly 2,700 aircraft. To their east, 170 Soviet divisions were caught unprepared, their commanders paralyzed by disbelief. In the opening hours, chaos reigned. German diaries recall columns of men and vehicles stretching beyond sight as Wehrmacht units stormed across rivers and fields. For Soviet soldiers, the moment was surreal. One recalled waking to the earth shaking and the sky aflame, with no clear orders but to fight or flee. Civilians, startled from sleep, watched from burning villages as the thunder of tanks and aircraft announced the arrival of war on an unimaginable scale. This sudden eruption was the violent collapse of an uneasy pact. Less than 2 years earlier, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had divided Eastern Europe between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. But for Hitler, the alliance was always temporary, a mask hiding his true ambition. Lebensraum in the East. Barbarossa was his gamble to destroy the Soviet state, seize Ukraine's wheat and Caucasus oil, and annihilate what he called Judeo-Bolshevism. Confident in Blitzkrieg, he envisioned a swift campaign, believing the Soviet Union would crumble within months. The reality on June 22 revealed the magnitude of that gamble. In the north, Army Group North surged into the Baltic states, aiming for Leningrad. In the center, Army Group Center smashed toward Minsk and Smolensk, opening the road to Moscow. To the south, Army Group South advanced into Ukraine, seeking control of its fertile plains and vital resources. Along a front stretching 1,800 miles, German divisions advanced with terrifying speed. Soviet units, still reeling from purges of their officer corps, were encircled and annihilated in pockets, their defenses collapsing under the weight of German mechanized thrusts. Eyewitnesses on both sides captured the terror and awe of the opening. A German panzer officer described the spectacle. The sun rose over endless dust and smoke. Ahead lay Russia, vast and without end. We felt the weight of history. A Soviet civilian later recalled, "We saw the sky filled with planes, so many that it was as if a swarm of locusts descended. By noon, our town was in flames. For the Red Army, the shock was devastating. Airfields were obliterated, with over 1,200 Soviet aircraft destroyed in the first day alone, many still on the ground. Railways were severed, command posts destroyed, communications in disarray. Yet beneath the triumph of those first hours lay a dangerous overconfidence. German planners believed the campaign would last only 10 to 12 weeks. They expected Soviet resistance to collapse as swiftly as that of France. Few in the German high command considered the sheer vastness of Russia, the resilience of its people, or the logistical nightmare of sustaining millions of men across endless plains and primitive roads. Barbarossa's opening revealed both its brilliance and its fatal flaw. A war of annihilation launched with no clear plan for what lay beyond the first victories. For Stalin, the invasion was both a shock and a humiliation. Despite months of intelligence warnings, he had refused to believe Hitler would strike so soon. In Moscow, he withdrew into stunned silence while his generals scrambled to salvage defenses. Across the front, Soviet soldiers, often with outdated rifles and little ammunition, were ordered to resist. Many fought and died where they stood. Others fled eastward, retreating into the endless spaces of Russia. As night fell on June 22nd, the cost of that first day was staggering. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers lay dead or captured. Hundreds of villages burned. German forces, buoyed by their rapid progress, pressed deeper into Soviet territory, convinced they were on the path to victory. Yet the seeds of disaster had already been sown. By unleashing Operation Barbarossa, Hitler had opened the gates of hell, committing Germany to a war of unprecedented scale and brutality against an enemy whose strength had only begun to awaken. This was no longer a war of conquest. It was a war of annihilation, one that would consume millions, redraw the fate of nations, and ultimately doom the Reich itself. And as the smoke of June 22nd drifted across the steppe, both armies marched into a struggle that would define the course of the 20th century. The thunder of June 22nd, 1941, did not come from nowhere. To understand Barbarossa, one must first rewind to a scene of cold calculation in Moscow. August 1939. There, under the gleam of chandeliers, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop signed a pact that stunned the world. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was publicly a non-aggression treaty, but its secret protocols carved Eastern Europe like a map on a table. Germany would take Western Poland. The Soviet Union would seize Eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and Bessarabia. Two ideological enemies, sworn to destroy each other, became temporary partners in crime. For Hitler, the pact removed the nightmare of a two-front war, giving him freedom to invade Poland and trigger the Second World War. For Stalin, it bought time to rearm an army gutted by the purges of the late 1930s, when thousands of Red Army officers had been executed or imprisoned. But behind the smiles, neither trusted the other. As one German diplomat remarked, "We shook hands, but each counted his fingers afterward." The uneasy alliance quickly bore fruit in blood. On September 17, 1939, Soviet troops rolled into eastern Poland as Wehrmacht forces advanced from the west. Polish defenders, already crushed by Blitzkrieg, faced a second invasion that sealed their fate. Soon after, the Soviet Union absorbed Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania and moved into Bessarabia. For a moment, the balance seemed stable, but beneath the surface, the partnership was poisoned by suspicion. By 1940, the contradictions sharpened. German war industries grew dependent on Soviet raw materials. Oil, grain, manganese, and cotton flowed westward in endless trainloads. Between 1939 and 1941, the Soviets supplied millions of tons of resources that kept the Reich alive under British blockade. At the same time, Hitler privately raged at Stalin's opportunism. The Soviet occupation of the Baltic coast and pressure on Finland signaled to Berlin that Stalin would not remain a passive partner. Even before France fell in June 1940, Hitler's gaze had shifted east. The stunning collapse of Western Europe emboldened him. He believed Britain held out only in hope that the Soviet Union might one day join the fight. To crush Britain, he concluded, Germany must destroy the Soviet Union first. In December 1940, he issued Directive No. 21, Operation Barbarossa. Planning for the greatest invasion in history began while trains of Soviet grain still crossed into German territory. The months that followed were marked by deception and denial. German officers quietly studied maps of the Soviet steppe, rehearsing the logistics of war on a colossal scale. Wehrmacht divisions were repositioned eastward under cover of training exercises. In the Soviet Union, soldiers drilled with outdated rifles and horse-drawn artillery, unaware of the storm gathering beyond their frontier. Meanwhile, warnings poured into Moscow. British intelligence, American diplomats, and even Soviet agents abroad reported the buildup of German forces. Richard Sorge, the Soviet master spy in Tokyo, sent precise details of Hitler's intentions. Yet Stalin dismissed them all as provocations, convinced that Churchill sought to drag the USSR into war prematurely. He clung to the pact, believing Hitler would not risk a two-front conflict while Britain still resisted. "Hitler is not such a fool," Stalin reportedly remarked. It was one of the most catastrophic misjudgments of the war. The uneasy calm of 1941 was heavy with foreboding. German officers later recalled the surreal contrast, one day receiving shipments of Soviet oil, the next preparing their troops to seize the Caucasus oil fields by force. Soviet soldiers at frontier posts watched German activity with suspicion, but were ordered not to provoke. Some wrote in diaries of the uneasy peace, sensing that war was near but unsure when. In truth, the collision was inevitable. Hitler viewed the Soviet Union not only as a military target, but as the ideological enemy of his vision of Europe. To him, Barbarossa was a war of annihilation, aimed at exterminating Bolshevism and enslaving the peoples of the East. Stalin, blinded by mistrust of the West and overconfidence in his own reading of Hitler, failed to grasp how near the catastrophe lay. Thus, as spring turned to summer in 1941, the stage was set. The pact that had once shielded both powers now lay hollow. The Soviet Union, lulled into complacency, stood unprepared. Germany, confident in its arms and intoxicated by victory in the West, readied a strike of unprecedented fury. When the artillery roared on June 22nd, it was the sound of betrayal. The temporary marriage of convenience had ended, replaced by the bloodiest campaign in history. And in that betrayal lay the seeds of disaster for both sides. The thunder that erupted on June 22, 1941, did not fade. It rolled eastward with devastating speed. The German Blitzkrieg, honed in Poland and France, now stretched across a front more than 1,800 miles long. 3 massive army groups surged into the Soviet Union, each with a distinct mission that together promised the destruction of Stalin's empire. Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, struck toward the Baltic states and Leningrad. Army Group Center, commanded by Fedor von Bock, held the decisive thrust, driving through Belarus toward Smolensk and ultimately Moscow. To the south, Gerd von Rundstedt's Army Group South pushed into Ukraine, eyeing its fertile farmland and vital oil fields. Together, they represented over 3 million men, 3,600 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,700 aircraft, the largest invasion force ever assembled. The opening blow was shattering. Luftwaffe bombers descended in waves upon Soviet airfields. By the end of the first day, more than 1,200 Soviet aircraft had been destroyed. Many caught on the ground, their wings still chained to runways. "We were helpless," one Soviet pilot later recalled, describing how he and his comrades watched German fighters rake burning planes with gunfire before circling back for another pass. The Red Air Force, caught unready, was crippled before it could rise to fight. On the ground, armored spearheads tore into Soviet defenses. Panzer divisions, supported by mobile infantry and artillery, raced deep into the hinterland, bypassing strong points and leaving them to follow-up forces. The speed was dizzying. Villages awoke to the sight of German tanks grinding down roads, while columns of infantry in gray uniforms marched behind, raising clouds of dust against the endless steppe. The first great encirclement came at Minsk. By July 9th, less than 3 weeks into the invasion, 4 entire Soviet armies had been surrounded. Nearly 300,000 Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner, staggering in columns toward the west under the eyes of their captors. Many had fought to the last bullet before surrendering. Others were bewildered conscripts, drafted with little training and thrown into the maelstrom. A German officer wrote in his diary of the endless masses of prisoners trudging past, their faces hollow with exhaustion. The pattern repeated itself again and again. At Smolensk, another 300,000 Soviet troops were encircled. At Uman, in the south, 100,000 more were cut off and destroyed. German armored thrusts moved with such precision that Soviet units often found themselves surrounded before they realized the depth of the German advance. For the Wehrmacht, it seemed confirmation of their belief in Blitzkrieg, the rapid, coordinated destruction of enemy forces through speed, shock, and encirclement. But behind the triumph lay brutality. Villages caught in the path of advancing divisions were shelled without warning. Civilians, bewildered by the sudden collapse of Soviet power, often found themselves at the mercy of an occupation that brought hunger, executions, and repression. Roadsides filled with abandoned Soviet vehicles, some burned out, others left in desperate flight. Soviet survivors later recalled the chaos, units cut off from communication, officers missing, and soldiers stumbling blindly into battle without ammunition or orders. The sheer scale of destruction was staggering. By September 1941, the Wehrmacht had captured more than 2 million Soviet prisoners. The Red Army, seemingly shattered, reeled back toward the heart of Russia. German propaganda declared victory inevitable. Soldiers wrote home of a war nearly won, of Christmas spent in Moscow. Many Wehrmacht officers believed Stalin's Colossus was about to collapse, just as France had fallen the year before. Yet even in the summer of triumph, cracks began to appear. The vast distances of the Soviet Union stretched German supply lines thin. Roads turned to dust under the weight of thousands of vehicles. Horses collapsed, pulling overloaded wagons. Fuel trucks lagged behind, forcing tanks to halt until supplies could catch up. Ammunition stocks dwindled. What had been designed as a lightning war threatened to slow under the immensity of the land itself. More ominously, Soviet resistance, though battered, did not break. New divisions appeared seemingly from nowhere. Factories east of the Urals churned out tanks and aircraft. Civilians were conscripted to build defensive works, while propaganda urged them to fight for the motherland. Soviet recruits, sometimes with little more than a rifle between them, were hurled into the fight. One survivor recalled the terror of marching toward the front with the sound of tanks and screams already filling the air. Knowing survival was unlikely. By late summer 1941, the German Blitzkrieg had achieved astonishing victories. Armies had been annihilated, cities captured, and vast territories overrun. Yet the Soviet Union still stood. Its armies, though mauled, continued to resist. Its factories continued to produce. Its people, though terrorized, remained defiant. The Germans believed they were on the cusp of total victory. But in truth, the illusion of easy conquest was beginning to fade. Behind the thunder of Blitzkrieg loomed the endless steppe, the harsh Russian winter, and an enemy that refused to die. The summer of triumph was only the opening act of a war that would test the limits of endurance, both for the invaders and for the nation they sought to destroy. The summer victories of 1941 had convinced many Germans that the Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse. Entire Soviet armies had been encircled and destroyed. Prisoners marched westward in endless columns. Yet, as army groups north, center, and south pressed deeper into the Soviet Union, the reality grew darker. The vastness of the land, the determination of its defenders, and the brutal methods employed by Stalin's regime ensured that Hitler's dream of a lightning conquest would not come easily. As German armored spearheads pushed east, they encountered a land stripped bare. Villages had been emptied, wells poisoned, and crops torched. Stalin's scorched earth policy denied the invaders shelter and sustenance. Bridges were dynamited, railways torn apart, factories dismantled or destroyed. In some cases, entire towns were burned to the ground by retreating Soviet troops. One German soldier later wrote that, "We marched for days and found nothing. No food, no water, only ashes and silence." Still, resistance did not vanish. At Smolensk in July 1941, Soviet forces fought ferociously, despite being outnumbered and encircled. For 2 months, Red Army divisions clung to the city and its surroundings, slowing Army Group Center's drive toward Moscow. German commanders were stunned at the ferocity of the defense. Though another 300,000 Soviet troops were captured, the delay bought precious time for reinforcements to arrive further east. In the south, the struggle for Kiev revealed both Soviet resilience and tragedy. Surrounded in September by a vast German pincer movement, nearly 600,000 Soviet troops were captured, the largest encirclement in military history. German diaries recorded the sight of prisoners stretched across the horizon, shuffling past in endless misery. Yet even in defeat, the Red Army bled its enemy. German casualties mounted, and precious weeks slipped away. Behind the front lines, Stalin issued his infamous order, number 227, not one step back. It was both a rallying cry and a death sentence. NKVD commissars enforced discipline with ruthless severity, executing deserters and cowards on the spot. Soldiers were ordered to fight until death or capture, and retreat without orders was treated as treason. For many Soviet troops, survival depended on obeying orders no matter how impossible. Civilians, too, were drawn into the struggle. In forests and swamps, partisan bands began to emerge. They sabotaged rail lines, ambushed convoys, and assassinated collaborators. Though poorly armed and often hunted with brutal reprisals, their actions forced the Germans to divert men and resources to rear-area security. A Wehrmacht officer complained in his letters home that the forest is full of ghosts, describing nightly explosions on rail tracks and sudden sniper fire from hidden tree lines. For ordinary people, the cost was unbearable. Millions fled eastward ahead of the invaders. Those who remained faced hunger, fear, and violence. Survivors remembered nights spent hiding in barns or forests, listening to the rumble of artillery in the distance. Some were executed as partisans. Others starved when food was requisitioned or destroyed. One Soviet civilian recalled her family burning their own wheat fields before retreating. So the Germans would find nothing but smoke. For the Germans, the war grew harder with every step. Endless forests, swamps, and rivers slowed their advance. Roads turned to dust in the summer heat, then to deep mud with the autumn rains. Supply columns stretched hundreds of miles, vulnerable to partisan raids. The speed of Blitzkrieg faltered under the immensity of Russia's geography. And yet, the Red Army did not collapse. Despite losing millions of men, it raised new armies, replenished from factories now relocated beyond the Urals. Despite losing cities and vast territories, Stalin's state continued to function. The Germans had underestimated both the capacity of the Soviet Union to absorb punishment and the determination of its people to resist at any cost. By autumn 1941, Hitler's war of annihilation was no longer the swift campaign he had imagined. The Soviets had bled and burned their land to deny him victory. Partisans stalked his soldiers in the forests. The Red Army, though mauled, remained in the field. The dream of conquering Russia in a matter of months had begun to unravel. The march east continued, but the first cracks in the German illusion of easy triumph had appeared. The Soviet Union, though battered and bleeding, refused to die. And as the Germans pressed onward, they would soon find themselves facing a far more terrible enemy than they had expected: the Russian winter. By the autumn of 1941, the war in the East had reached a critical crossroads. The Wehrmacht had driven hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, capturing millions of prisoners and vast swaths of land. Yet the Soviet Union, though wounded, had not fallen. For Adolf Hitler, the answer lay in Moscow. The Soviet capital was not only the political heart of the regime, but also a vital hub of railways, industry, and communication. To seize it, he believed, would be to shatter Stalin's state and end the campaign before the year was out. Thus was born Operation Typhoon, the final decisive thrust. On October 2, 1941, German Army Group Center surged forward once more. Panzer spearheads cut deep into Soviet lines near Vyazma and Bryansk, executing massive encirclements. Within weeks, more than 600,000 Soviet soldiers had been taken prisoner, their remnants trudging westward in columns that seemed to stretch across the horizon. German officers exulted in dispatches, describing the Soviet army as annihilated. To many, Moscow now appeared within reach. In the capital itself, panic spread like wildfire. Government ministries prepared to evacuate eastward. Archives and factories were dismantled, shipped to the Urals to preserve them from capture. Rumors swirled that Stalin himself might abandon the city. Trains jammed with civilians fleeing the oncoming storm rolled out of Moscow, their passengers clutching bundles of belongings. Yet Stalin remained. Defying both his generals and his advisors, he declared, "We shall not surrender Moscow." His decision bound the fate of the Soviet Union to the city's defense. The Soviet preparations were immense. Soldiers, civilians, and even schoolchildren dug trenches, built anti-tank ditches, and erected barricades around Moscow. Reinforcements streamed in from the east, Siberian. Divisions hardened by the brutal winters of the Far East. Freed from guarding the Japanese frontier by a neutrality pact and reassured by intelligence that Tokyo would strike south against the United States and Britain, these troops brought fresh strength and experience. One German officer later admitted, "The Siberians fought like demons, impervious to the cold that crippled us." But the German advance slowed. The roads, once dry and dusty in the summer, became seas of mud in the autumn rains. Supply convoys bogged down, and fuel grew scarce. Vehicles were abandoned along the roadside, their tracks buried in mire. Soldiers, exhausted from months of marching and fighting, struggled to keep pace. The Wehrmacht's logistical system, designed for quick campaigns, strained to breaking point over the immense distances of Russia. When the frost finally came in November, the ground hardened and the panzers could roll forward again. German units pressed to within 20 miles of the Kremlin, their forward patrols glimpsing the distant spires of Moscow. Artillery shells landed in the city's outskirts, and Luftwaffe raids darkened the skies overhead. For a moment, it seemed as though Hitler's gamble might succeed after all. Yet winter arrived with a ferocity few had anticipated. Temperatures plummeted to 30 degrees Celsius. The Wehrmacht, expecting to win the war before the snows, had not issued proper winter clothing. Soldiers wrapped themselves in blankets, scarves, and stolen civilian coats. Frostbite claimed thousands. Machine guns froze, lubricants thickened, and engines refused to start. German diaries described men huddled around fires, their boots stiff with ice, their weapons unreliable in the bitter cold. "We are fighting more against the winter than against the Russians," one soldier recorded. For the defenders, the suffering was equally harsh, but their determination was fueled by desperation. The defense of Moscow became a symbol of survival itself. Red Army soldiers clung to frozen trenches, their breath steaming in the night air, as German tanks loomed out of the blizzards. Civilians endured hunger and bombardment, yet continued to work in factories or dig fortifications. In early December, when reinforcements from Siberia launched counterattacks along the Moscow front, German forces were thrown back in disarray. The Battle of Moscow marked the first great strategic failure of Hitler's war in the East. The Blitzkrieg had shattered against the vastness of Russia and the iron resolve of its defenders. The dream of a swift campaign had dissolved into a nightmare of snow, starvation, and endless resistance. Operation Typhoon had been intended to end the Soviet Union in a matter of weeks. Instead, it revealed the limits of German power and the resilience of Stalin's state. As the Germans reeled backward from Moscow's gates, the illusion of easy victory was gone. The war in the East would not be decided in months, but in years, and its outcome would determine the fate of the world. On December 5, 1941, as the Russian winter settled in with temperatures plunging to 30 degrees C, the balance of the war shifted. Along the frozen front outside Moscow, the Red Army struck back. After months of retreat and devastation, Stalin's forces unleashed a massive counteroffensive, the largest yet attempted by the Soviets. What the Germans had dismissed as a beaten enemy now re-emerged with renewed strength and determination. Soviet ski battalions glided across snow-covered forests, moving silently in white camouflage. T-34 tanks, their broad tracks perfectly suited to the frozen ground, surged forward against German positions. Unlike the Wehrmacht's panzer divisions, many of which lay crippled by the cold, the T-34 thrived in the bitter winter. German soldiers later wrote of their shock. "They came at us through the snow, machines and men that seemed born of the ice itself." The offensive struck across a 200-mile front. From Kalinin in the north to Tula in the south, German lines buckled. Exhausted troops, frost-bitten and undersupplied, fell back under the relentless Soviet push. Entire divisions that only weeks earlier had believed Moscow within their grasp now found themselves retreating, leaving behind shattered vehicles frozen in place and comrades stiff with cold on the battlefield. For the Wehrmacht, the psychological impact was devastating. Since 1939, Blitzkrieg had brought victory after victory. Warsaw, Paris, Belgrade. Now, for the first time, German forces were in retreat. The aura of invincibility, carefully cultivated by propaganda and reinforced by lightning campaigns, began to crumble in the snow before Moscow. Diaries captured the disbelief. One soldier wrote, "We thought the Russians were finished, but now they come at us like wolves, stronger than before." In Berlin, Hitler's fury boiled over. He dismissed several senior commanders, including Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, and took personal control of the army. He issued a fateful order. The German soldier must stand fast. No retreat would be permitted, no matter the cost. For countless German troops, this meant dying where they stood, their frozen bodies dotting the steppe. On the Soviet side, the counteroffensive was not only a military turning point, but a profound moment of morale. For months, soldiers and civilians alike had endured catastrophe. The fall of Kiev, the encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk, the enemy at Moscow's gates. Now, at last, they had turned the tide. Eyewitnesses recalled the exhilaration of driving the enemy back, even as snowstorms blinded them and frost gnawed at their flesh. A Red Army veteran later remembered, "For the first time, we felt the Germans could be beaten." The counterstroke did not destroy Army Group Center, but it shattered its offensive capacity. German forces were pushed back between 60 and 150 miles, away from the capital they had come so close to seizing. The Kremlin remained standing, its red stars glowing defiantly through the winter nights. The price, however, was staggering. Both sides left tens of thousands of dead on the frozen fields, their bodies claimed as much by the cold as by bullets and shells. Villages lay in ruins, their inhabitants caught between the retreating Germans and the advancing Soviets. Civilians endured hunger and terror, many reduced to scavenging for food in the wreckage of their homes. Yet the meaning of December 1941 reached far beyond Moscow. In the same week that the Red Army launched its counteroffensive, Japan struck Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States into the war. What had begun as Hitler's gamble to knock out the Soviet Union in a single campaign now unfolded into a truly global conflict. The myth of Blitzkrieg had been broken. Hitler's dream of a swift, decisive victory in the East dissolved in the snows before Moscow. The German war machine, though still formidable, had shown its limits. The Soviet Union, battered but unbroken, had proven it could not only endure but strike back. From the frozen trenches and forests of December 1941 emerged a new reality. The Eastern Front would not end in months, but in years of grinding war. And for Hitler, the invasion that was meant to secure his empire had become the beginning of a struggle that would doom it. Montgomery also transformed morale. He toured the front lines constantly, speaking directly to ordinary soldiers. His presence, tall, lean, and wearing his trademark black beret, gave the men confidence that they had a leader who believed in victory. Unlike Rommel, he rarely exposed himself recklessly to danger, but his steady hand reassured an army weary of improvisation and defeat. Material reinforcements followed. The arrival of American M4 Sherman tanks gave the Eighth Army a decisive boost. Their heavier armor and 75 mm guns outclassed many of the German Panzer III and IV models. Alongside them rolled British Crusaders and Grants, forming armored brigades that Montgomery carefully conserved for the decisive blow. Air superiority, too, tipped in Allied favor. The Royal Air Force, bolstered by American squadrons, harassed Axis convoys and pounded supply depots. But preparation was not merely mechanical. Training became relentless. Soldiers drilled in combined arms tactics, practicing how infantry, armor, and artillery would coordinate in the open desert. Camouflage nets were strung over gun emplacements. Dummy tanks were positioned to confuse Axis reconnaissance, and mine-clearing drills rehearsed the brutal task that awaited them at El Alamein. Life in the desert remained punishing. Sandstorms swept across the camps, blinding men and clogging machinery. Water was rationed, sometimes to less than a gallon a day, leaving soldiers perpetually thirsty. Letters home spoke of searing heat by day, freezing nights, and the constant struggle against flies, dust, and exhaustion. Yet, under Montgomery's system, these hardships no longer felt aimless. Each drill, each repair, each convoy was part of a larger plan that the men could sense taking shape. Commonwealth troops, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Indians, and Free French units played a vital role in this transformation. Their presence gave the Eighth Army both numbers and a sense of international resolve. Many of these men had been fighting in North Africa since 1940, hardened by years of desert war. Under Montgomery's unified command, their experience was sharpened into a disciplined fighting edge. Montgomery was patient. He refused to rush into battle, even as London and Cairo pressed for quick results. He told Churchill himself that the Eighth Army would fight on his timetable, not Rommel's. The men, though restless, came to respect this deliberate approach. One officer later noted that Montgomery gave them something previous commanders had not: the certainty that we would not go forward until we were ready, and that when we did, we would win. By October 1942, the transformation was complete. The Eighth Army was no longer a force in retreat, but a confident, reorganized, and heavily armed juggernaut. Its ranks swelled to over 200,000 men, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks, 900 artillery pieces, and the might of the Desert Air Force. The Desert Rats, once beaten and weary, now carried themselves with the conviction that they could match Rommel blow for blow. Montgomery had forged them into a blade, and soon that blade would strike. The stage was set for El Alamein, where preparation, discipline, and resolve would meet the cunning legend of the Desert Fox. By the summer of 1942, Rommel's Africa Corps stood at the very edge of triumph. After sweeping through Cyrenaica and smashing British defenses at Gazala, his forces surged eastward, driving the Allies back in a retreat that seemed unstoppable. On June 21st, Tobruk fell, and with it came a staggering Allied loss of supplies and prisoners. Cairo trembled, and in London, Churchill spoke grimly of the crisis in North Africa. The road to the Nile lay open, but Rommel's army was exhausted. Supply lines stretched more than 1,000 miles across the desert, dependent on convoys crossing the Mediterranean under constant attack by the Royal Navy and the RAF. Fuel was scarce, ammunition rationed, and vehicles broke down faster than they could be repaired. Still, Rommel pressed on, hoping momentum would carry him to Alexandria. By early July, he reached El Alamein, a narrow bottleneck where the desert met the Mediterranean Sea. To the north lay coastal salt marshes, and to the south, the unforgiving Katara Depression, impassable for tanks. The geography left only a narrow corridor for battle, a natural choke point that nullified Rommel's talent for sweeping maneuvers. Here, waiting for him, was the British Eighth Army under General Claude Auchinleck. Though battered and demoralized, Auchinleck had reorganized his forces into defensive lines, bristling with barbed wire, anti-tank ditches, and vast minefields. Artillery and infantry dug deep into the sandy ridges, determined to make El Alamein the place where the Axis tide would break. On July 1st, Rommel struck. Waves of German and Italian troops advanced under a scorching sun, only to be met with thunderous artillery fire. Dust clouds rose over the battlefield, blinding tank crews and choking infantrymen. One British soldier later recalled, "You could taste grit in every breath, and when the shells came in, the sand itself seemed to explode." Fighting raged for days. Rommel's armored spearheads probed along the coastal road and inland tracks, but minefields forced them into narrow lanes where British guns waited. At Ruwaisat Ridge, New Zealand and Indian divisions counterattacked fiercely, often at bayonet point. The desert floor became a graveyard of shattered panzers, burning trucks, and wrecked artillery. Auchinleck himself took direct control of the battlefield, moving between headquarters and forward units to steady his men. He ordered aggressive counterstrikes whenever Axis forces seemed poised to break through. On July 10th, Australian troops launched a ferocious night assault at Tel El Asa, overrunning Italian positions and capturing hundreds of prisoners. Their success not only stalled Rommel's advance, but boosted Allied morale at a moment of deep uncertainty. Conditions were brutal. Daytime temperatures soared above 45 degrees Celsius. Water was rationed to a single bottle per man, and soldiers often fought parched and delirious. Flies swarmed over trenches, drawn to the unburied dead. A German officer later wrote in his diary that the desert reeked of fuel, blood, and decay, a place where men and machines died together. By mid-July, Rommel's offensive had stalled. Lacking fuel and replacements, his units could not sustain the pressure. Auchinleck's stubborn defense, combined with relentless RAF bombing of Axis supply lines, forced the Desert Fox to halt his drive toward Alexandria. The Eighth Army, though bloodied, had stood its ground. The First Battle of El Alamein ended in stalemate, but it carried enormous significance. For the first time in months, Rommel had been stopped. The myth of his invincibility cracked, and the Allies gained precious breathing space to rebuild. As the guns fell silent in late July, both sides dug in. Rommel withdrew slightly to regroup, awaiting reinforcements that never truly came. The British, meanwhile, braced themselves for the next round, soon to be led by a new commander, Bernard Montgomery. The Desert War had reached a turning point. The stage was set for a battle that would decide not just the fate of North Africa, but the course of the Second World War. On the evening of October 23, 1942, the stillness of the North African desert was shattered by a thunder that could be heard for miles. At precisely 21:40 hours, more than 1,000 Allied guns opened fire in unison, hurling shells into Axis positions along a 40-mile front near El Alamein. The bombardment was so intense that men later said the desert seemed to shake beneath their boots. For 15 minutes, the sky flickered like lightning as thousands of explosions ripped apart the night. The opening salvo marked the beginning of Operation Lightfoot, Montgomery's carefully planned offensive to break through Rommel's defenses. The name carried symbolism. Infantry would advance first, light-footed enough to pass through the minefields. Only once engineers cleared safe corridors could the heavy armor, the tanks, follow. Those minefields were infamous. Known as the Devil's Gardens, they stretched in dense belts, laced with anti-tank and anti-personnel mines, barbed wire and concealed gun emplacements. Montgomery knew that tanks rushing blindly into them would be slaughtered. So on that first night, it was the infantry who shouldered the burden. British, Australian, New Zealand, South African, and Indian troops rose from the desert floor and advanced into the darkness, bayonets fixed. Engineers crawled forward with mine detectors and bare hands, probing the sand while tracer rounds whipped overhead. One British sapper later recalled, every click of the detector could mean salvation, or death. The shells didn't stop, and you never knew if your next step would be your last. Progress was agonizingly slow. The artillery barrage had announced the attack, leaving German and Italian defenders fully alert. From fortified positions, machine guns cut through the desert air, and mortars crashed among the advancing infantry. The minefields themselves claimed victims, men blown apart by sudden eruptions, others trapped by barbed wire as bullets raked the sand around them.